what they were arguing coming into the end of last year, before the pandemic, was that the economy was really perfect. We've attained a perfect economy, perfect balance of inflation and growth. That's the way we were coming into the pandemic, according to the Fed.
Yeah. And the best economy ever, according to Trump, yes.
Yes. Unemployment was 3.5%, and inflation was contained, and it was just perfect, sustainable growth. Not so. And if you take out inflation, fourth quarter of 2019, retail sales contracted quarter to quarter. Now, the fourth quarter is your holiday shopping season. First quarter also contracted. This is before the pandemic. And then along comes March, and we get hit with a pandemic, and things collapse. But we were already headed into a recession here that had been triggered by the Fed through their overly aggressive tightening, and now they're going to overly aggressive easing. And the problem is that they don't want the system to collapse. That's what they're faced with. And they're going to create whatever money they have to create to keep the system from collapsing. The problem with what Powell indicated at the time of his first pandemic address is that, look, they'll do whatever they have to do to keep things from collapsing. That's probably a good idea. But the process here is they're going to open the creation of money supply, infinite creation, no limits. They'll back up whatever has to be backed up. And that's all fine. So the system doesn't collapse, except it does tend to reflect in inflation. And that's where you can get a hyperinflation. They're not putting any limits on their money growth here. They're not putting any limit on their bailouts. And if you look at the so-called core inflation, that's their target, well, guess what? If you look at the month-to-month changes, last couple of months, you're seeing the highest rate of monthly growth in the CPI last couple of months in something like 20 years for the core CPI.
Welcome back to Liberty and Finance. We have a returning guest. John Williams is renowned for his work at shadowstats.com, where he reveals what's really going on in our financial statistics, despite what we're being told by officialdom. John, thank you for joining us again here on Liberty and Finance.
Don, again, thank you so much for having me.
We just had another meeting of the Federal Reserve this last week where they announced basically unlimited, as far as the eye can see, low interest rate policies, and yet claiming that we are not attaining the inflation rate that they were hoping for in the economy. One could argue about why they want inflation in the economy. That's a separate topic. But could you bring us up to date on what you're seeing as the main takeaways that people need to be aware of at this time regarding the economy, but specifically as reported by the Fed and where the gaps are there?
Well, the Federal Reserve is, as they pointed out, as Chairman Powell pointed out, have dual mandates of containing inflation and maintaining full employment. None of which you're doing. The headline inflation rate that they target is at 2%, 2 percentage points. At least that's what they used to target. And that's referred to as core inflation, which is inflation net of food and energy costs, which, of course, are insignificant to most people, which that's absolute nonsense. But that's a gimmick they played all along here. But it's not just out of the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, which is commonly reported. It's the core inflation rate for what they call personal consumption expenditures, what people spend in the GDP, which is further gimmicked. Right now, it's year-to-year change is down around 0.6%. They say, oh, this is too low. We've got to get it above 2%. So what they said they were going to do is take policy actions to boost inflation to above 2% as they measure it there. So it's not actually measured by the Bureau of Labor Statistics as the CPI usually is, but this is by the Census Bureau and their GDP estimates and such. And they want to keep it above 2% for some time so that it will average 2% over some time. The only way they can increase the inflation, at least the standard practice, is to explode the money supply, which they have been doing. Since the pandemic broke open, and they've addressed it and basically opened up all the money spigots that they could, and said they would create whatever money they had to create, and they've been doing that. You right now have money supply M1, which is the narrowest money. It's basically the cash in hand and the cash in the system, the bank, liquid bank accounts. Year-to-year growth there is about 40% right now. Never been seen. It's never seen anything like that before. It is some of that's the more liquid elements coming out of M2 and M3, which haven't grown quite as quickly. But with what the Fed reaffirmed here is they're going to keep buying assets as much as they need to. They've got to get the inflation up there. So they're going to keep expanding the money supply, creating inflation. But they're not looking at actual inflation as the poor American consumer looks at it.
Right.
Again, they exclude food and energy, but even there, that's a very gimmicked number. All sorts of changes and definitional changes have been made over time, where the consumer price index, which is what most people look at as the inflation number, has been altered over time to redefine key components to bring down the headline inflation. What the government started to do back in the early 80s was to reduce the headline consumer inflation, because if they could do that, then they could reduce cost of living adjustments that they paid to people on Social Security and government pensions, and that would help to reduce their budget deficit. And separate from that, you had some gimmicking that went on in terms of the traditional definition of inflation. It used to be that it was you'd have a fixed measure of a good. You wouldn't change it, but you'd have a fixed quality. But what they would do is say, well, steak's expensive, but chicken isn't as expensive. So if steak gets too expensive, this is what Alan Greenspan was arguing back in the mid 2000s. If steak gets too expensive, people are going to buy more chicken. And while that may be true from a practical standpoint, when you're looking at your cost of living, what you want to know is, what does it cost me to maintain a constant standard of living?
Right.
That's the way the CPI used to be defined. And Greenspan argued, let's change it to substitution base. So if steak goes up in price, people will buy more chicken, so it'll give greater weighting to chicken or hamburger, whatever it is. And that has been done in certain areas, so that you're seeing a significant understatement of the headline inflation today against the way it used to be before they started with the gimmicks. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, first big change they made was back in the early 80s. For the same basic concept, we have to bring down the headline cost of living here. They changed the way they calculated the cost of housing, which is a big component of the consumer price index. Back in 1980, they calculated that including the cost of buying a house. I mean, it was a part of the formula and the cost. People buy new homes. Cost of buying a house would be the cost of having a house. But rather than leave that intact, they changed it, and they worked in all sorts of factors. And what they define it by now, the cost of a homeowner's equivalent rent. What a homeowner, this is deemed by the government, there's no straight measure of this, completely made up number. What a homeowner would pay himself to rent himself his own house. And with the homeowner increase the rent on himself each month, and that goes into the housing calculation. Well, that knocked 1.4 percentage points off the headline consumer price index, and that's a cumulative number going forward year after year after year. What I've done is I've looked at the changes they've made in the CPI over time, and if the CPI today were measured the way it used to be, the way it was defined when people were thinking of having some variation of the CPI adjust cost of living adjustments for Social Security, Today, that'd be in August. It would have been 9%, where the headline CPI, the one that gets all the press, is 1.3%, and where the number that the Fed is looking at is down around 0.6%. So it's they're not containing actual inflation. In terms of full employment, there are all sorts of games that have been played with employment over time, and there they have a real problem, which I think they recognize. The headline unemployment was redefined back in 1994, and the headline unemployment is still basically defined the same way today as it was back then, and you got to a record low of 3.5%, or 50-year low, as touted by the Trump administration coming into the end of the year. What happened with the unemployment rate? That unemployment rate is what was 3.5% back in late 2019. Now is 8.4%. It reached a peak of 14.7% in April, and there's some other issues with that. Very specifically, the government's had problem counting its numbers. And there's a common theme here. Unlike prior eras where people just gimmick numbers and publish them, if you look at the different government reports, you take a look at the unemployment report, for example. They say, here's our headline number. And by the way, we did have a problem with surveying, and some of our representatives in the field didn't understand their directions, and they misclassified some unemployed people as employed. And this was what they were explaining anyway back in March, when they missed 1.5 million people who were unemployed. They said, look, we can't, once the survey is complete, we never alter it. So we're just leaving it as it is. So what was then a headline 4.4% and should have been 5.3% unemployment rate if it was accurately measured, it so far has been the low of the pandemic in April. The headline rate jumped to 14.7%, but then they found they had 7.5 million employed that had been misclassified as employed. Difference being that the unemployment rate was really 19.5%, but they still use the 14.7% in the release. You'll see that's what the popular press picks up on. So you generally haven't had good quality reporting of what's been happening here, and the discrepancy has narrowed. It dropped to 4.9 million in May, and 1.9 million in June, and 1.3 million in July, and in August they poo-pooed it at 1.1 million. It's really not meaningful difference between the headline 8.4% and 9.1%, which is still far away from full employment. And if you consider that I have some significant problems with the way these numbers are put together. Back in 1994, before as NAFTA was being brought on board, the Bureau of Labor Statistics redefined its unemployment series. The headline U3 number, it left its definition effectively intact, although they did change some surveying techniques, which I think had some effect on it. But what they did was they changed some of the broader measurements and definements. And back then they had something that was referred to as a discouraged worker. Now, the headline unemployment is a person someone who's counted as unemployed, is someone who wants to work and is actively looking for work but hasn't been able to find a job yet.
Right.
That's an unemployed person. They have to look for work in the last month. Then there's a discouraged worker, is one who's given up looking for work because there are no jobs to be had.
Yeah.
And as it's defined today, if they're discouraged for a full year, then they're just dropped from the rolls of the alternate unemployment measures. They're no longer counted. But back before 1994, if you'd been discouraged for more than a year, you were still counted.
Uh-huh.
And what the government did not want to do is have a big buildup in long-term discouraged workers who were being replaced by NAFTA. So they redefined away the long-term discouraged workers. I still track and have been estimating for some time what that would be. And if you put back in headline unemployment, that would allow for the way the discouraged workers used to be counted, the displaced workers, the long-term discouraged workers, that's up around 28%.
Wow.
So even with the headline, you're at 8.42%. That's not full employment, but the Fed is looking to do that by stimulating the economy by pumping up the money supply and lowering interest rates. So it's what they found was because they couldn't get the core inflation above the 2% target as they measure it, they just have to create more money supply, and they're moving the target higher. And conveniently, that creates inflation, and inflation is what they want here.
Boy, you've already covered enough topics to my head is exploding from the different important avenues we could plunge into. If we could just hit a few of the high points. One of the things that you talked about was the government redefining the criteria by which they report things. And then there's all these trickeries like the substitution method and so on. It sounds to me like it corresponds with what we've seen, which is basically the politicians will promise you what you want to hear. If you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor. Or in this case, we're going to have defined benefits for Social Security recipients. We're going to have defined benefits for pensioners. And then they're going to move the goalpost and redefine the criteria against which they're actually going to declare that they're following through and delivering on the promises to where, we're going to index your benefits for inflation, but we're going to reserve the right to define what's real or what your real experience is. If you follow that to its logical conclusion, it seems like people could end up getting pinched tighter and tighter and tighter where they're eating watery gruel for soup, and then they're saying, well, we're going to substitute watery gruel, so that doesn't cost much, so there's no cost of living increase there. And then also on the retirees or whatever are actually getting their Social Security benefits, and pensioners are getting their pension benefits reduced artificially by this manipulated CPI. Am I getting that part right?
Well, their benefits have been reduced legally by the actions taken back in 2005 by Congress to do exactly that. Now, they haven't changed the methodology on the headline inflation that's used there since then. I mean, this has been an ongoing problem. But what the Fed is looking at in terms of it wants to look like it's a hero and it can keep inflation down. The inflation number that it's using is absolutely the lowest number in the definition of inflation that you can find, and doesn't have much relationship to what people see in the real world.
Right. That's what I'd like to get into.
And that there's a serious area there, because the one thing I was looking at as we were coming towards late 2019, the Fed was touting how it was being so monetarily frugal and proper and had everything in perfect balance. I think the way John Williams was the assistant chairman, no relationship to me, used to be the chairman of the San Francisco Fed, said what they were arguing coming into the end of last year, before the pandemic, was that the economy was really perfect. We've attained a perfect economy, perfect balance of inflation and growth. That's the way we were coming into the pandemic, according to the Fed.
Yeah, and the best economy ever, according to Trump. Yes.
Yes. Well, unemployment was 3.5%, and inflation was contained, and it was just perfect, sustainable growth. Not so. And it never was. They never recovered from the banking crisis and the Great Recession. Everything they did there was to bail out the banks, not the U.S. economy. What you saw happening here, as the Fed started to tighten at the end of 2019, you had a little stock crash around Christmas time.
Mm-hmm.
And then all of a sudden they realized, maybe we're pushing things too far in terms of slowing down the economy. Why would you want to slow down an economy that was perfect? But that's exactly what they were trying to do. So they started to pull back, and then the economy actually was slowing coming into the pandemic.
Yes.
You had, if you look at retail sales, for example, it's broader measures you'll get on the consumer, and I've got problems with the way they measure retail sales. They reported in nominal terms before inflation adjustment. So, of course, the headline numbers are always greater, but if you take out inflation, fourth quarter of 2019, retail sales contracted quarter to quarter. Now, the fourth quarter is your holiday shopping season. First quarter also contracted. This is before the pandemic. And then along comes March, and we get hit with a pandemic, and things collapse. But we were already headed into a recession here that had been triggered by the Fed through their overly aggressive tightening, and now they're going to overly aggressive easing. And the problem is that they don't want the system to collapse. That's what they're faced with. And they're going to create whatever money they have to create to keep the system from collapsing. The problem with what Powell indicated at the time of his first pandemic address is that, look, they'll do whatever they have to do to keep things from collapsing. That's probably a good idea. But the process here is they're going to open the creation of money supply, infinite creation, no limits. They'll back up whatever has to be backed up. And that's all fine. So the system doesn't collapse, except it does tend to reflect in inflation. And that's where you can get a hyperinflation. They're not putting any limits on their money growth here. They're not putting any limit on their bailouts. And if you look at the so-called core inflation that's their target, well, guess what? If you look at the month-to-month changes, last couple of months, you're seeing the highest rate of monthly growth in the CPI last couple of months in something like 20 years for the core CPI. Now, you're not seeing it in the headline CPI because we had what we had is a oil price war at the beginning of the year, and gasoline prices more than anything else will dominate the month-to-month numbers, particularly when they're, in this case, have been dropping or staying low. That tends to suppress the headline CPI, and they like to take that out of the calculation because usually gasoline prices are rising, which means that the CPI is rising more than they want to have to address. So they have something of a conundrum there. But right now, we are seeing a pickup in core inflation. And if you were looking at it against the CPI, they're talking about this, so we're going to have to target inflation above 2% for a couple of years, so it'll average out at 2%. I think they're going to be above 2.5% the next 2 to 3 months. The money that they pumped into the system is already creating inflation. That's one reason that you've seen surging gold prices. Gold is a pretty good indicator of where inflation's going. It will respond, but it is also a predictor of where it's going, and I found that over time. And as I measure inflation, you'll find that gold rallies in line with my inflation rate, not with the headline inflation rate. So you say, oh, gold's getting too expensive. Not in terms of actual inflation that people are experiencing. It's maintaining the purchasing power of their dollars. And that's what gold's done over the millennia. So it's one defense I can offer to you here against a Fed that is spinning its wheels is on some physical gold.
What about the other impacts to individuals of true inflation? Now, you mentioned today how it is used by understating the true inflation rate. They're able to underpay retirees, whether it's elderly receiving Social Security or whether it's pensioners. What about artificially pushing up people's adjusted gross income and pushing them into alternative minimum tax? What about artificially appearing to have capital gains when you go to sell things because of the devaluation of the currency? Or what about excessive expansion of the currency, as you're mentioning right now, that's basically overreacting because you're under-measuring the rate of inflation? Are those all effects of...
We're underestimating the rate of inflation.
Yes.
What I'm saying is there's a way you can still measure inflation in a way that was consistent with...
Correct.
The way it was when people actually were looking at inflation, and gold still tends to go along with that.
Right. So, yeah, E.B. Tucker we had on saying gold is a truth serum, and it'll tell you what's really going on. Yes.
Yeah. People are living on income that is growing with the CPI, or whatever the government is giving them. They have a special chained CPI, which is lower than the headline CPI that they use for adjusting Social Security adjustments. So they particularly penalize people on Social Security. It's criminal as far as I'm concerned. People paid their taxes in good
Yes.
in good faith, and then the government decided, well, we're going to cut the inflation rate, so we're not going to have to pay them as much. The whole idea of the inflation rate was to give people enough income so that they could cover the inflation costs. So it's not surprising that you'll hear complaints from people who are living largely on Social Security or some other fixed pension that's tied to too low an inflation rate. I can't make ends meet.
Yes.
And it's no fault of their own, other than they trusted the government would give them an amount that would cover their cost. And right now, you don't have anything. The inflation rate's very low, so there's not going to be any great Social Security adjustment there this year. It's going to be artificially low the way they're doing it. It should be. It should be much higher.
That was one of the questions that people have been asking, specifically about the relationship between misstated inflation versus the nominal price of gold. We have a question from Loston Akash, who says, what should the price of gold and silver be according to your inflation analysis?
The funny thing here is, when I started my alternate inflation measure, which was to make up for what the government was not covering, such as the housing costs, and there are all sorts of gimmicks that they put in over time.
Yes.
What I did was I set the series equal to the CPI back in 1970. Now, back in 1970, we were still on the gold standard, and it was reasonably close. I think it was $70, but it wasn't too far off from what became the 100 base in my series. And when I plot my series against the gold price, they basically move together, although
Yes.
the gold price tends to move in advance. The gold price, my point is that the gold price basically is keeping up with actual inflation the way that it used to be measured. So if you look at my index, you'll find that it's, there's some variability and variance in lead times, but gold is effectively, what you see in the way of gold price is effectively where you should be in inflation terms if you look at it in against some base year. Take the price of gold. If you don't have my series, just take the price of gold from one point in time to another point in time, and that'll give you a rough estimate of what the actual inflation is. I think if you look at it since Nixon took us off the gold standard back in 1970, that the headline inflation's been, as I measured, is something like 5,000%. And you'll find that the price of gold's going up by about 5,000%. It tracks like that over time, so that it's simple way to look at it is if you see gold rising, it probably means that inflation's rising, and gold tends to lead the inflation rate a little bit, because the people who are investing in gold have a pretty good sense of where the inflation's going.
Interesting.
I didn't do that deliberately. I found that one day I decided, let me just plot gold against my inflation number, and they were almost coincident. I was shocked, and then I figured out what I had done. So it's.
A viewer named Tony asks, how are you modifying the inflation numbers from how the government is doing it today?
The inflation numbers I have match the government's up through 1982, which is when they started to change methodology. Why did they change the methodology? Because they wanted to reduce the headline inflation, and in doing so, it would be a way of reducing the cost of living adjustments that the government would have to make on Social Security benefits and the cost of living adjustments to people on government pensions going forward. The first big change they made was the early 80s, 81 or 82, I think it was 82, where they changed the housing component of the CPI, big portion of cost of living for people. And up to that point in time, one of the components in that housing component was the price of buying a new home. And they decided to change that from price of buying a new home to a concept of homeowner's equivalent rent, what a homeowner would pay himself or herself in the way of rent to live in the house in which he lived. and the actual month-to-month inflation rate was the amount that the homeowner would pay would raise the rent by on a month-to-month basis to himself or to herself. That added order of magnitude 1 full percentage point. It subtracted 1 full percentage point from what had been reported. It was 1.4 percentage point of the headline CPI up to that point in time. So that was a reduction right there, and that's cumulative going forward, and a lot of changes going forward. And right now, if you look at that's the first change that I have in my alternative measure. If you adjust for the changes that were rather significant up through the mid-90s, and it hasn't changed much since the mid-90s, right now you'd instead of looking at the headline CPI is 1.3%, my number is 9%, 9.0%. And that's the difference in terms of the change. And in terms of, right now, that's the year-to-year change. That would be what you could possibly expect for, in the current basis, year-to-year change in gold prices, 9%. Gold prices will move with that, and that year-to-year change is beginning to pick up rapidly because we've had some artificial depressants in the headline CPI recently with the collapse in oil prices. But that's where the numbers stand right now.
Speaking of benefit payouts and retirements, Conrad asks, do you see programs like VA disability benefit payouts and other military pensions being canceled over the coming years?
Canceled? No, I can believe they might try and monkey around with the cost of living adjustments on them again, but that would be a criminal act as far as I'm concerned, and I think most people would think so. People have done things for those pensions. You don't cancel people's pensions. This is not a bankrupt company, although the nation technically is in terms of its debt against
I was going to say
what it's bringing in. And unfortunately, the way they do that, the way they take it off, they don't just say, "Oh, we're not going to pay it." What they do is they inflate their way out of it. And if you get a hyperinflation here, and let's say inflation gets up to 50% this year, and you're seeing cost of living adjustments of 0.5% or 1% on your fixed
right
programs, you're losing a lot of money.
Yeah, another viewer, Steve W., quoted, he said, remember Greenspan's comment, we can guarantee benefits as far into the future as you like, but we can't guarantee what its purchasing power will be.
Yeah, it would be nice if they guaranteed the purchasing power. I think that's something that should be written into the law. That's a good idea. But real purchasing power.
Question from Susan Liang says, how many adults of working age are now unemployed and for how long because of the COVID-19 shutdown of the economy?
Okay, this is, you have to keep in mind that we're looking at a circumstance here where the worst of the layoffs, in theory, are behind us here. And what I'm looking at here are the numbers of people that are in trouble at this point in time.
Okay.
Now, if you look at the payroll, and that's anyone who's earning a paycheck, seasonally adjusted, in August you're at 140.9 million. 140.9 million is the total employed as of August. That's down from 151.1 million in March and 152.5, which would probably be the benchmark number to look at in February. So basically, you're looking at a drop of 10 million people in terms of payroll employment. In terms of the employment and unemployment, those numbers are different. On the employment and unemployment, you're only counted as employed here once. But right now, you're looking at 13.6 million unemployed, and that's up from 5.8 million in February. So you're saying the number of unemployed people are up, order of magnitude 8 million. In terms of the headline employment, keep in mind includes some unemployed people who are defined as employed. This is from the payroll survey. So again, you're looking at something over 10 million, a drop in the employment level. Either way you look at it in terms of the payroll survey or the household survey, and that's as of August.
Okay.
You were down another 20 million in May, which was the trough.
A question from onlineadvertisement.net who says, have you seen government data even more unrealistic during this year compared to other years? And they're surmising, is it because of the election or because of COVID gyrations?
Absolutely, and it's a combination of factors. The reporting quality is generally bad with the government statistics, and it's been exacerbated by what's happening with the COVID. And I'm glad that question was asked because we have some measures of that. And aside from the bad numbers with the unemployment numbers, you consider they just published, in the last week or so, the annual survey of income and poverty, national survey for the year 2019. And conclusions, according to their survey, the headline gain in household income, net of inflation, average for the United States last year was 6.8%. That's really quite remarkable. I don't know too many people who got a 7% raise last year, but net of inflation, but that's what they're showing. And they show that real median income went up 1.4%, and the poverty rate dropped to 10.5% from 11.8, dropped 1.3%. Now, that's all wonderful news, except it's nonsense. What a remarkable statement followed out of the issuing Census Bureau after they released that. And what they said, quote, given data collection challenges during the pandemic, we were concerned about the bias in the 2019 estimate. Well, what they go on to talk about is that although the numbers here are pre-pandemic, this is when the economy was slowing down thanks to the Fed. The surveying was done at the peak of the pandemic, the hit of the pandemic, in March and April, and they have no idea what the numbers are. They're trying to re-estimate it. They're guessing that maybe income really grew at 4.1%, but they have all sorts of problems with the survey. It's absolute nonsense. And I can tell you that if they're off on their income number, guess what? So is the poverty estimate. The survey is absolutely worthless. And a big problem with the COVID disruptions. And then let's say you look at series such as retail sales, also out of the Census Bureau. You look at the current numbers, they have a comment there. What they'll tell you is that they've looked at the numbers and they're satisfied that they meet their publication standard. Well, if you read further in the footnotes, you can find all this if you go to their website and click on any of the reports. And they'll have a little box there, COVID-19 effect. And say, we've reviewed everything, and everything meets our publication standards, which doesn't tell you too much given what they publish. But if you look at the finer detail, something like the retail sales, they say, well, we had to change seasonal adjustments, and had we not done these things and these things, the growth rate would have been much closer to zero than it was, up 0.6% this last month. And there's some funny things there. You look at retail sales, for example. That's one series that, if you take inflation out of it, which they don't when they report it, actually has recovered to its pre-pandemic level, which is great news, except it's not particularly credible, at least in terms of what I'm looking at. Normally, when an industry recovers, you'll find that the labor numbers also recover for that industry. Right. Retail sales are still down year to year, even allowing for some special circumstances where sales shifted from mom and pop retail shops to buying online. The numbers just don't jive. Right now we're seeing a lot of very poor quality reporting. Nobody knows to the full extent of how bad it is, but I can tell you it's probably more positive than reality. That's generally the bias that I found here. I've dealt with the departments here. I started looking at getting into the numbers back in the early 90s with the various departments, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the Commerce Department, Bureau of Labor Statistics. That's the time that I began publishing forecasts commercially. But before then, what I did was all private. And I got to know the people at the different agencies, and I had a unique series of econometric models that forecast the economy. And when I sold my product out into the in the private industry, I usually ended up with customers who were a chief economist of major corporations or banks, and often they'd come out of the government reporting agencies. And we talk about the numbers, and the common sense that you get, it's changed some over time, but If you look at the people who were working in administrations prior to when I became active in the public, Richard Nixon wanted to use the unemployment rate that was the lowest, either seasonally adjusted or not seasonally adjusted, but without telling people which it was. That's why I mentioned earlier what they did with the new claims for unemployment insurance. Reminded me of Nixon because they changed the reporting right in the middle of the season. They didn't provide a consistent series of the new series. They didn't continue the old series on a consistent basis. They just changed it. And it was a change that needed to be made, but you don't just break the series and don't have a consistent historical comparison.
Right.
So what they published was the old series and the new series, one week apart. They had to give people 1 week's notice on this. And 1 week apart, between the old series and the new series, the new claims dropped by 130,000. And headlines went that way, and that's the way they published their press release. And even the headlines, new claims down to the lowest level since the pre-pandemic panic. But that was nonsense, because if you looked at the series on a consistent basis, and I can estimate that, and you can see it if you look at the year-to-year change in the unadjusted series, which will always be consistent. There was really no change. The series, the series is flattened out. It's L-shaped, as we're seeing with the unemployment numbers, as we're seeing with the year-to-year change in the payrolls. We're seeing a stall in the economy right now, which no one wants to see, but it is there. So in terms of the quality of the numbers we're seeing, the economy's bad. It's not going to improve much as I can see it before the end of the year. Still going to be down year to year. You need a turnaround in the pandemic situation to really start to get to get a meaningful turnaround in the economy. That'll get a good vaccine, good treatments. People get confidence that they don't have to worry about it too much. That's when you'll start to see the economy coming back to life and the employment numbers recovering. I don't think they're going to get much better than they are now for a while.
We have a different question from Jonathan Stringer, who asks, are there large differences between rural and city inflation? If so, how do I gauge inflation for a rural setting when cities probably sway the stats so heavily?
Well, it is. There certainly are, and I can't tell you the specifics, but there are regional estimates of the CPI, and I don't work with them, but I can tell you that my adjustments would be largely proportionate. You're not going to see extraordinary differences there. But if you look at regional inflation measures, and I think you can get them by state. I'm not sure. I've never again worked with that much. But I would be happy to look into it and let you know the next time we talk. But if you do look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics website and try to get some regional breakout on inflation, you can get more rural areas versus the urban. I'd expect the rural areas would have lower inflation, but again, even the lower inflation there will be significantly understated against the way it was measured back before 1990.
One more question. There's been talk about extending the long bond out. Paul Montgomery says, if or when bonds go perpetual, will that cause deflation of the money supply? If so, what happens to the purchasing power of the dollar?
The idea with a long bond is that you have an inflation measure there. I mean, you have a yield that will satisfy people for holding the instrument over an extended period of time. If it's not a realistic measure and inflation goes higher, which would mean that yields generally would go higher, the value of that perpetual bond will decline, and in the type of inflationary environment that I'm seeing here, that's the last place I'd put my money, because I think you're going to see an extraordinary acceleration in bond yields, so that as the yields rise, the value of existing bonds will decline to give you the effective effective return. And if you get into a hyperinflation, which is a possibility, they become worthless. So I would stay away from government instruments.
One more comment from a viewer, and that is, it's a joke actually. Where do central bankers live? And the answer is in debasement.
That is very good. Thank your listener for that quote.
Well, John, we want to stay connected with you because as those who have left government and gone into the ranks of business found, they need to find somebody who's telling the truth because they're trying to make decisions, and we can't make decisions based on lies. So how can our viewers stay aware and prepared by plugging into the information that you provide?
Well, I have a website called shadowstats.com, and I also sell with that. You can go to the website for free, and you get a lot of information there for free. I have a newsletter that goes out several times a month called Shadow Government Statistics, and it's a subscription to that, which is available. You log in to get it off the site, a PDF. It costs $175 a year, $89 for 6 months. And if you look at my website, you'll find that after 3 months, all the newsletters are available to the public. I also have in my website, right-hand column, I cover the headline news as it breaks, which will end up in the newsletter. And my numbers are and graphs are generally available to non-subscribers if they look around the site. So it's shadowstats.com is the name of the website.
Great. We've been talking with John Williams, founder of shadowstats.com, this time on Reluctant Preppers and Liberty in Finance. John, thank you for joining us.
Donegan, thank you again so much for having me.
To acquire gold and silver, just go to libertyandfinance.com. When the main site comes up, click on Bullion Sales. That's libertyandfinance.com, Bullion Sales. You'll see my name, Donegan Kaiser, my phone number, and my associate, Kaiser Johnson, his phone number, our email, libertyandfinance@protonmail.com.